I have a bunch of hardcover books that I haven't done anything with, so I decided to make this one over. It had originally a yellow cover, so I painted it with a few coats of my DIY chalk paint. And now I'm going over the whole thing with a glue stick. I decided to try glue instead of Mod Podge this time because I'm using a full sheet of tissue paper. I'm not going to be cutting out the image for this one. I thought I would try just putting the whole image right over the book. And let me tell you, this worked amazing. So it might be something that I might look into for some other projects as well that are flat. I'm not sure that using all of this would work on a round project, but I'll be checking it out and letting you know. I'm just going to smooth everything out and make sure that it dries completely. I flipped it over and used my craft knife to cut off any of the excess. Then towards the spine, I used a ruler and I pulled off the extra tissue paper that I didn't need, just making sure that all of it came off because I'm going to do something different with the spine area. I used some sage chalk paint that I have and I just painted over the spine. So just a little bit on top as you see here and then around to the other side as well. I'm going to cover the seam with this ticking stripe ribbon and just use some hot glue on either end to tack it in place. I'm going to make sure that it's a full coverage on the back side as well because this might be a book that I stand up for decor instead of lay down. I made a sweet little two-fingered bow and I'm going to hot glue that towards the bottom of the book just for something different. If you want to learn how to make a double loop two-finger bow, I have a tutorial listed down in my description box. I thought the spine needed something a little bit extra. I didn't like it just plain, and so I printed off some French script on a piece of tissue paper, and this time I'm using Mod Podge simply because there's some ripples on the edge of the book, and I wanted to make sure that I had glue in all of the right areas. So I'm just going to apply a thin layer of Mod Podge and then press the tissue paper in place. And I decided to go all the way around the book to the back as well. I did go over the top of this tissue paper with some Mod Podge, but I did not do that with the peony because it was stuck down really well and I didn't really want it to muck up. So I'm just going to go ahead and gently apply a little bit of the Mod Podge to the top of the script, and then I'm going to use some sandpaper to just sand off the edges of the tissue paper. Then I just used my craft knife again to cut off the excess tissue paper. I'd like to take a quick second to thank all of my current subscribers and viewers. I really appreciate each and every one of you. If you are not subscribed to my channel yet and you like what you see, I would love it if you could hit that red button too. If you've been following me, you know how much I love to use tissue paper on my projects. I just think it's a really inexpensive way to bring a high-end look to what you're making. I've got these eggs from Dollarama and I love the size of them, and I also love the fact that they're a matte finish. They are plastic, but they don't have that shiny plastic finish to them. I'm going to use Mod Podge to apply and make sure that all of my tissue paper lays as flat as possible. Because the eggs are rounded, you're going to get some wrinkling and some bubbles, but just work them out the best you can. I found this lavender printable and the eucalyptus printable that you can see on my desk there from Creative Fabrica. I have a link to that website down in my description box. They have some freebies that you can look through. They also have some designs that you can purchase for not that much money. And if you really like their website, you can sign up for a subscription. Originally, I had a different idea for these eggs, but then I decided to print off these little French country labels. This first one is a bunny, and then the one on the lavender egg is a bird with a nice frame around it. But because these weren't going to show up on top of what I already have on the eggs, I'm using some white paint instead of Mod Podge to apply these tissue paper prints. This is going to make them pop a little bit more because there's no color underneath them, and it's also going to make the tissue paper stick. To smooth out the design, I used my finger this time because of course my brush has white paint on it this time. And I'm just going to do it very delicately and make sure that it's all stuck on there really well. If I need any extra paint, I'm just going to use my brush and go underneath the tissue paper and fill it in where I need it. And I think these eggs turned out really pretty. For this project, I'm using these paint your own Easter bunnies from the dollar store. And there's 3 different styles in a pack, and you can see they're just so sweet. I'm just going to use the 2 larger ones, and I'm going to put the smaller one aside for a different project. I'm starting off by painting them with a dark gray chalk paint, and then I'm going to just let them dry completely. I'm using just some regular candle wax to apply onto the rabbit, so my next layer of paint will make it really easy to distress. You can use as much wax as you want, or you can just do a little bit. I've covered this guy pretty heavily with some wax, and I did the same for the other bunny. Now I'm going to paint them with 1 coat of Parisian gray chalk paint. It's just a lighter color of gray, making sure I get into all the cracks and crevices and everything is painted solidly. Then I'll set them aside to dry completely. When the paint dries, you can see where the wax is because it is a little bit of a different color. Now I'm going to do the same thing, applying the wax to the bunny one more time, but I'm just going to hit it in a few different areas, not too much this time. For the third layer of paint, I'm just going to use my DIY white chalk paint, and I'm just going to give it a rough coat. It doesn't have to be covered completely because I want these to look really old and weathered and rustic. Once it's completely dry again, I'm going to use this plastic scraper, and you can use any type of plastic scraper. It can be a credit card, anything that you can just easily get that wax to come off. And you can see here that it's just pulling the paint off wherever the wax was applied. Because I did it twice, I'm getting some of the dark color through, and I'm also getting some of the lighter gray color through. And that's what I wanted to achieve. I wanted this to look like little concrete bunnies that have been sitting out for a really long time and are starting to get the effects of the weather. So originally they may have been painted white, but now they're just kind of cracking and chipping and peeling off and looking absolutely beautiful. I wanted them to look even a little bit more aged, so I'm using some brown wax and just applying it with a paper towel. I'm going to make sure I get into all the nooks and crannies because that's going to make it look like the dirt has been piling up over the years. And I really, really love how these bunnies turned out. This project is upcycling this tin one more time. You can see I've already done something to it, but it needs a refresh. I'm going to use this color called Mushroom. It's a latex paint, and I added some talc to it so it's really nice and thick. I'm going to use a fat stippling brush and a pouncing motion to get some really good texture on this tin. It's going to need 2 coats to cover it, but it turns out looking like or a crock, which is the look I was going for. I gave myself a really great treat a while back. I ordered myself some of the IOD sprig stamps. These are my favorite from IOD, and I wanted to get them just because I thought they would be so beautiful on different projects. And putting all of these with tissue paper onto a project like this really takes a long time. So using the stamps is so much easier and more convenient, and they're absolutely gorgeous. I'm using my black ink pad and I'm just going to go ahead and stamp these on. Now I left them on the backing sheet and I just cut out the backing sheet rather than using the thin mount. The thin mount is an extra product that you need to purchase. At some point, I may actually do that, but for now, I'm just going to practice with these. Some of the designs did not come out the way they should have, although this lavender was beautiful. And then I made sure to clean my stamps from the ink right after I'm done with them. For this next stamp, I decided to only ink up half of it, so I would have all of the blossoms kind of going out to one edge, and I think that turned out pretty neat. I continued alternating the stamps all the way around the tin until I got back to where I started. I have to tell you, I'm so happy with this investment of these IOD sprig stamps. They are gorgeous. DIY number 5 is using this little thrifted urn that I picked up at the thrift store. It's just resin and it did have a few cracks in it that I just used some hot glue on the inside to hold them in place. But I'm going to be applying a little bit more of this antiquing wax, which is the bare brown wax, and that will camouflage some of the cracks as well. I'm using a chip brush to make sure I get into all of the nooks and crannies, and then I'm going to use a baby wipe to just kind of dab on top, get some of that wax off of the raised edges and make it stay in the nooks and crannies, and then it just looks really old and vintage. I'm using up a lot of the greenery that I already have. I've had these vine pieces for a couple of years in my stash, and I thought, you know what? I've got too many boxes of greenery floating around. So I wanted to use up what I have, and these were perfect. Some of them stood straight up, like this first one, but some of them hang really nicely. So I decided to make this sort of a weeping willow kind of topiary. And so what I do is I trim the branches, I figure out how I want it to sit, and then I use hot glue to put it in place. Once it was all built, I looked at it and I decided that I still really didn't like how the bottom was looking. There was still a little bit of that green poking through. So I'm taking a stenciling brush from the Dollar Tree, a little bit of white paint that I'm tapping off the excess, and I'm just going to stipple some of the white on it. And this made it look absolutely beautiful. To start off this first project, I'm going to be printing a design on tissue paper. I just use dollar store tissue paper, but I always make sure that the shiny side is facing down when I tape it onto a piece of printer paper. Now, some of you have mentioned that your printer paper gets stuck or it gets shredded because of the tissue paper on it. You could also try a piece of cardstock, which would be a little bit thicker. The other thing you could try is using some masking tape, which I find tends to help because it does make the paper itself a little bit thicker and a little bit easier for the printer to grab. On the sides of the tissue paper, I like to take the tape and fold it over like this. So it's got to be folded onto the back of the paper, and that just makes it even more secure. This is the design I'm going to use, and I have a link for it down in my description box.
This is a little mini teapot that I'm going to use for this project. And to get rid of the shiny surface, I'm going to give it a really good coat of Rust-Oleum Clear Matte Finish. Once that dries, I'm going to use the color Sheepskin by Folk Art. This is a chalk paint, and I'm going to give everything a couple of really good coats, letting it dry really well in between. Another problem that some of you have asked me about is your inkjet printer running when you're printing it on the tissue paper. When you apply the Mod Podge, then it tends to run. What you can do is also use that same Rust-Oleum Clear Matte Finish, give it a couple of sprays, let it dry for at least an hour, and then try it one more time. Most of the time, that Rust-Oleum will seal in the ink and then you won't have any bleeding at all. I'm going to apply the tissue paper using Mod Podge, a thin amount just where I want the tissue paper to be, and then I'm going to place it on top. I cut this pattern into a diamond shape, and I'm just going to be putting 2 of those pieces on either side of the teapot. I'm not going to worry about the spout or the handle right now. Use a very light touch when you're pressing down with your paintbrush on top of the tissue paper. You don't want it to tear. I wanted this teapot to have a little bit of a French country look, so I did look online to see if I could find any inspiration, and this is what I came up with. I loved how the handle and the lid were painted a little differently, so I'm going to paint the knob and the handle and the spout and the bottom rim of my little teapot with this beautiful eucalyptus green color. I did a couple of coats of the green and made sure I got inside the spout. Once it was completely dry, I just sprayed it with a glossy finish sealer, and I think this turned out absolutely beautiful. I just love the pattern of it, and I hope you love it too. For this next project, I decided to make a wreath using this wreath form. I had used it for a different project earlier on, and I'm just pulling out all of the greenery. That's why I love these grapevine wreaths. You don't have to actually glue anything in if you don't want to. I wanted to make a beautiful spring wreath, and this is my inspiration. It's a little bunny wreath that came from the Pottery Barn website. I'm not going to put the ears on mine, but I am going to be using the creamy whites and the pinks and a lot of the soft green florals for this project. I'm going to start out by putting the white rose in the center, and then I'm going to flank it with 2 of the pink ones, and then those are going to be flanked with 2 of the creamy ones again. And that's just going to start creating the base of the wreath. This time I do want these flowers to be permanent, so I'm using some hot glue on the bottom of each of the stems and then pushing it into the grapevine wreath so it's really secure. I'm also going to be using some of this greenery that I got from Michaels. I really love the frosted look of them. They're sort of like a lamb's ear. They're kind of dusty, I guess you would call them. And I just love that kind of a look. It just softens up the green. I love green and bright green for the summer, but for spring, I really love these softer colors. Next, I took this smaller rosebud and put that a little ways up on the wreath, and I'm going to make a little arrangement right here, and then I'll duplicate it on the other side. I'm going to use some of the same greenery. I'm going to use some cherry blossoms that you can see there on the really large rose. I've added some there, and I've also got a little bit of dogwood and some hydrangea blossoms that I'm going to create sort of a little arrangement within an arrangement. So here I have some pink petals that were used in a different project that I kept and saved because I'm a crafter. I save everything. And I'm going to use a little bit of hot glue and just pinch it together and then add additional petals. So this looks like a little rosebud as well. And this turns out really pretty. And this is the reason why I pulled out the white ones, because I thought they were just a little too thick. in my opinion. These turned out really soft and delicate, and they just looked so much better. All you do is just pinch them and then layer them together so they're not all in the same spot. I'm going to continue to fill up the wreath. I'm going to do it a little bit more sparse as I reach towards the top of the wreath. I don't want it to be hugely full like the inspiration, but I do want it to be really soft and delicate and romantic. I really love how this one turned out, and I hope you like it too. I'm starting off this project with two of these wood planks from the Dollar Tree and one of these larger signs. I made a mark where I want to cut it so it's just about a half an inch longer on each side, and I'm just going to use my miter box to create those. Then, using another one of the planks, I cut down two half-inch strips that you can see here. And this wood is really easy to cut down. I just used my box cutter. Now I'm using wood glue to apply everything and add it all together. What I wanted to do was just create sort of a little slotted piece of wood that has a hole in the center, but not a really big hole. You'll see what I mean here in a second. I'm going to use some clamps to clamp everything together and let it dry for a good half an hour. I'm going to use wood glue then to glue the two pieces together. I'm going to give this two really good coats of white chalk paint. This is the Bear brand. I've got just a little bit left at the bottom of the container, so I'm going to use it up. I'm going to paint a grain sack stripe in the center of this sign. So I'm using this piece of masking tape as my spacer. I'm going to use one that's a little bit longer, and I'm going to make sure that it's nice and straight and that I've got it securely taped down. Then I'll put another piece underneath my spacer piece and then pull that piece off. I decided to fold the masking tape down over the sides and then paint that area as well. The color that I'm using is a little bit lighter than for the teapot. It's still sort of a sage green, but this was a color from Martha Stewart that I really didn't like. So I added some darker green and some gray and came up with this beautiful light sage color. I'm going to be applying it fairly thickly, but not too thick. I want to be able to see a little bit of the brush stroke and a little bit of that white paint peeking through. You don't have to wait for the paint to dry for this step. I am going to use my blow dryer just to give it a little bit of a heat source so it can dry a little bit quicker. Look at how beautiful that looks, although I did have a little bit of a schmutz there. The next piece of tape is going to cover up the white space in between the grain sack stripe. So I'm going to go ahead and place that down, and then I'll place another piece of tape about a quarter of an inch in space away from the first piece of tape here. And that will give me my line for the thin grain sack stripe. And I'll repeat this process on the other side. I'll paint the stripes green again, making sure that I have full coverage, but not having that much coverage that you don't see a little bit of that white texture coming through. And again, I'm just going to go around the sides too. I have a clear stamp that is a swallow, which is a type of bird. I think it's a swallow anyway. It looks like one. I'm going to just put some ink on it. This is black ink and it's just from the dollar store. You can use basically whatever you like when you're doing your own projects. And I'm going to make sure that it's inked up really well. And then I'm going to place it right in the center of this piece. I'm not really sure what to call it, if it's a vase or a wood sculpture. You'll have to help me out with what you think it should be called. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and put the bird down and holding it really nice and steady with one hand, then just pressing it down, making sure that all of the areas come into contact with this piece. To give this more of an old and vintage look, I'm taking my chip brush with a little bit of black paint and just very lightly distressing all over the piece. I'm going to go along the back as well as a little bit on the front.
I surely hope that you enjoyed these projects and are getting inspired to create some spring decor for your home this year too. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.